for this. My name is Suzie Dawson. I'm a journalist, an activist, and the president of the Internet Party of New Zealand. I am extremely honoured to be here today with the man who is known as the grandfather of all whistleblowers. His name is Daniel Ellsberg. I don't think he needs much introduction, so I will just leave it at this. Dan has recently put together a book which is the culmination of his life's work. It is called The Doomsday Machine. Dan is also a very long time supporter of Julian Assange and of WikiLeaks. So it is a huge pleasure for us to have him here today to discuss with us the importance of supporting Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, human rights, and press freedoms. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Susie. Good to be here. Thank you.
So pleased to have you. Dan, for spring chickens like myself and those even younger, I was hoping that just as we look to you as being the grandfather of whistleblowing, I was wondering if you could begin by telling us about some of the historical influences on yourself and whistleblowers of your generation, and then maybe step us through to some of the influences on Julian, I know, such as Michael Ratner, for example, or people like that, who give us the history of these influences on whistleblowers.
Well, what you just asked reminds me of something that Julian told me, which I first heard it from a biographer of his, who said that Julian had talked to him and had given me some credit for inspiring him. And I said, how could that possibly be? I looked up his date of birth, and it was actually while my wife and I were underground eluding the FBI while putting out 17 more media outlets, in addition to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and the FBI was hunting for us. So I said, that being the case, I don't think he had, I'm sure he had other things on his mind in the hospital or wherever he was delivered. So I didn't see how I could have been an inspiration for him. It turned out that when I met him, he said, well, my mother was something of a hippie, and certainly a very anti-Vietnam War person, very activist. And she had raised me on the thought that what you had done was very good, and had put it in his mind. Really, I didn't think of that till just this minute when you raised it. I was very happy when Ed Snowden said a couple of times on Skype that, as he put it, without Dan Ellsberg, no Ed Snowden. And that was wonderfully gratifying for me to hear. And of course, in my case, there wasn't a prior whistleblower for me to emulate on that scale. I really waited almost 40 years, about 39 years after the Pentagon Papers came out, for someone to do essentially what I had done, which is to release a large amount of classified material, enough to make the case of government lying, or government violation, government recklessness, and deception in prosecuting a war. One document doesn't really do that, or even a handful. It's too easy to say, well, that was just some mid-level person. That didn't get to any high-level people. It was revoked the next day anyway. It's contradicted by all this. It's all overtaken. There was no pattern of misbehavior here. What you need to refute that government position is hundreds, even thousands of pages, as in the case of the Pentagon Papers, which were 7,000 pages, of which I gave 4,000 to the press, the various kinds of the press. And really, that had a good effect on public understanding of the war and resistance to it. And even though I was put on trial facing 115 years in prison, which was certainly meant to dampen emulation of that, to slow people down, that was understandable. Still, it was very disappointing to me that no one really did that year after year and decade after decade, until Chelsea Manning and the release by Julian Assange, first of the murder tape, the collateral murder tape, but then of the thousands of pages of documents from, I believe, Afghanistan was the first release that he made. Let's see, what was it? Iraq. I've got those two releases mixed up in my mind.
The Afghan war logs and then the Iraq
The Afghan was first, was it? Yes. So that showed me, now somebody is doing what I think needs to be done here. And I had taken nearly 40 years for that. You ask what influenced me? Well, it was the example of young Americans who were choosing to face trial and go to prison to resist nonviolently and truthfully what they knew to be a wrongful war that was continuing. And I knew the same. I knew it was just as wrongful. And their example of what was best for them to do, which involved risking and actually going to prison, almost 5,000 of them did go to prison, which put in my head the thought for the first time, what could I do to help end this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? And the now, rather than a question if, was there because I had just met two of those young men, Bob Eaton and Randy Keeler, at a conference of the War Resisters International in Haverford, Pennsylvania, and realized that they really liked me, but a lot younger, that I could identify with them very much. And what they were able to do was something I was able to do. And it was right for them, and it was right for me. So I took an act which I believed would put me in prison for the rest of my life, in my case. And in fact, as I said, I was charged with 12 felony counts, a possible 115 years in prison. So Nixon had in mind for me and did what he could to do what I'd say Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have had in mind for Julian Assange. And the difference is this. I was in the position of Chelsea Manning and later Edward Snowden, the two people I identify with most in the world. They started out in the system, in the government. They made promises, which they consciously chose to break, of keeping secrets when they realized that their oath to the Constitution, in effect, overrode that support of the Constitution against governmental lying that lied us into wrongful wars really took great precedence over the promise of employment that they'd made, the non-disclosure agreements that they'd made. And my wife is just coming in with breakfast. She promised. I'm afraid that'll have to wait. So
I wanted to ask, sorry to interrupt, but I actually wanted to ask you if your wife was one of the influences, because I know that she was.
Oh, definitely so. Actually, we broke up over that. So she wasn't an immediate influence on my decision to put out the papers. We were really separate for about 3 years after I had essentially broken our engagement because she was so accusing of me, it seemed to me, of being part of all this. That was in Vietnam when she was visiting me and we were engaged. And when she said, how can you be part of this, having just heard an account of our bombing of North Vietnam from a man who had come back from being on the International Control Commission and had witnessed it. And I felt I was being blamed for everything. I was against the bombing, as were many other people in the government. I was trying to curtail it, in particular in South Vietnam and North Vietnam, where I'd always opposed it. And even though I, in those days, was a cold warrior who supported the war, I saw it as hopeless by that time, that we should not continue to be killing. But I was trying to work from inside, I thought, to curtail the killing and to get the war over as possible. And I thought she wasn't giving me credit for what I was trying to do as an insider and blaming me for my whole association with it. Well, she was right, as I realized later. I didn't have any business being in Vietnam, even doing what I could, and not being on the outside opposing the war. But I didn't fully realize that until I'd read the Pentagon Papers after I came home. I got hepatitis in Vietnam, very possibly while sitting in an ambush in a rice paddy in South Vietnam, which had been undoubtedly fertilized with human fertilizer. Most of them were. I got hepatitis and I came back and again was trying really to get us out of the war and was part of a study called the study of, known as the McNamara study for the Secretary of Defense McNamara, who started a history of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. Now, very few Americans then and now thought of the Vietnam War, which we were still fighting, as having started in 1945. that was almost something of a secret. We were supporting a French effort to reconquer a colony, Vietnam, that had declared its independence just about now, actually, around July or August, I think it was, of 1945. In other words, by 1969, when I was confronting the decision to put out the Pentagon Papers, we had really been intervening in Vietnam as being the wrong side, on the side of the French, later essentially on our side, suppressing self-determination and independence of Vietnam. And we've been doing that since 1945. It continued really for a total of 30 years because it didn't end with the publication of the Pentagon Papers. It had 4 years to go, essentially, at that point. But
which would parallel actually to Chelsea Manning's, sorry to interrupt you, but that would actually parallel to Chelsea Manning's exposures in the Afghan war.
Exactly. I started by saying
the scaling down of the troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. There was this period of time that it took for the information to be digested by the public and even by the military brass before it actually resulted in those tangible withdrawals.
Yes, I'm sorry with my hearing. I didn't quite get all the last of that. But do you want to repeat the last bit you said?
Sure. I was just saying, I think what you just described, that there's this period of 4 years between your disclosures and the eventual withdrawals, that can be paralleled by Chelsea Manning's disclosures of the Afghan war logs.
That's very good. Yes. Well put. I have to think about that more because, of course, she also revealed, it turned out, the Iraq war logs. Mm-hmm. We've been at war in Afghanistan now since 2002, or really 2001 for Afghanistan. So that's 17 years. And 16 years, I guess it is, for Iraq. And that could well go on for another 16 or 17 years or even longer. Our Vietnam involvement, as I've said, was for a full 30 years. It was a 30-year war. So the simple revelation of truth didn't and hasn't mobilized public resistance to the point of actually overcoming the government's determination not to lose a war, not to be accused of having lost a war or withdrawn from a war, no matter how wrongful it was in the beginning and continues to be. Yes, that's
the disclosure.
Chelsea, and with Ed, for that matter, who revealed the NSA surveillance, which of course continues.
Yes, and so the larger point being that it is the spark. It is the spark, yes, and then it takes time.
What any one person does, whether it's Chelsea or Ed or Julian Assange or me, is at most one link in a chain of events which may help terminate the wrongs that we're trying to expose. In my case, say I wouldn't have thought of doing what I did do, for what it was worth, without the direct example of Chelsea Manning, of Bob Eaton and Randy Keeler, who went to prison. And of course, they were links in a chain. They had been induced to take that action by many people before them, and at the same time, and others. In my case, the actual release of the papers had no influence on the course of the war, because although it influenced public opinion quite a bit, as, for example, Ed Snowden's release had big effect on public awareness of things, did the policy change? And the answer is no in either case. And that's also true with Chelsea, unfortunately. Now, in my case, the president was so concerned about what other secrets I might have, in particular about his own nuclear threats against Vietnam, that he had to silence me as much as possible from putting out those other secrets beyond the Pentagon Papers. Many of those I discuss in my new book, The Doomsday Machine, which has the subtitle Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, because I was associated with genocidal plans for multi-genocide, actually, for the killing of hundreds of millions of people. And again, plans that I was trying to moderate, something that can't be moderated. How do you moderate threats of genocide? But I fooled myself into thinking, well, at least I'm on the right path here. I'm opposing the plans as they stand. Anyway, he was worried that I would put out plans like that against North Vietnam. And he had to silence me. And for that, he hired the so-called plumbers to stop leaks, to stop my leaks, essentially. And in the US, to do that, he had to take what were then criminal actions. He had them, actually, this is President Nixon, burglarize the office of my former psychoanalyst in hopes of getting information that would blackmail me into silence. It's often thought that he wanted information with which to slander me, hurt my reputation. Well, I was already under 12 felony counts, so with people who disapproved of what I did, my reputation was in tatters, let's say already. There wasn't much he could do to change that. What he wanted was information that I didn't want out about myself, my personal life, with which he could threaten me. They're actually, I can't even imagine what that could have been. But what he imagined, he tried to get and didn't find. So they went in, the idea though was to say, if you keep talking, if you put out anything more, we will release this. Well, he didn't find anything like that, and I say he couldn't have. But then he did efforts to shut me up totally, to incapacitate me totally, were the words on May 3rd, 1972, in a rally on the steps of the Pentagon. He brought 12 Cubans up, Cuban Americans who had been part of the Bay of Pigs back in 1961, still working for the CIA, essentially, one on a regular payroll, and brought them in to work for the government, they thought, to stop this traitor. And their orders were to incapacitate me totally. And the prosecutor, their prosecutor, William Merrill, telling me about this, used those words. And I said, what does that mean? Kill me? He said, the words were to incapacitate you totally. He said, you have to understand these guys, meaning CIA assets, don't use the word kill ever. They talk of euphemisms of neutralize, terminate with extreme prejudice, and various terms like that. He thought they were to kill me. My understanding from knowing what was happening at that moment, which was discussions of actually using nuclear weapons at that very moment, that month when they sent these people up against me during an offensive of 1972, I think their intent was to shut me up more than to kill me. One person said later my orders were to break both his legs. I think that wouldn't have done the job. They had to do something to my mouth for a good month or so while they were mining Haiphong and considering nuclear weapons. So when those same people were caught in the Watergate just a month or so later, they then had blackmail on the president, the crimes that they had committed for him against me. And they had to be kept silent. So he bribed them, in the case of Howard Hunt, $140,000. He was told by John Dean it might take $1 million for all of them. Nixon said on tape, it turned out, we can get that. I know where to find it. It's actually from one of the supporters of the coup in Greece by the colonels that we had supported, that brought in a regime of torturers in Greece, overthrowing the democratic government there. So the Greek supporters were prepared to give cash to Nixon in the White House for a purpose such as keeping them silent about crimes against me. The point being that when this came out, thanks to John Dean in particular, and earlier to James McCord and to Judge Sirica's pressure on McCord and the others to come clean, each of those contributed to what eventually confronted Nixon with the likelihood of impeachment and led to his resignation. And that, in turn, made the war endable some 9 months later. So each of us who in some way took actions that led to Nixon being out of office in 1974, an absolutely unforeseeable event in late 72, when he had just won a landslide victory. most people didn't know that Nixon intended to renew the bombing of North Vietnam after our prisoners were home in February of 1973, and to renew the bombing and to keep it going, keep the war going. They still don't really know that. I knew that, but I didn't have documents to prove it. It was Nixon's fear, reasonable fear, that I did have those documents that led him to take crimes which brought him down and made the war endable. Now, the reason for this long account is to make the point that each one of the people who contributed to that, John Dean, I've mentioned, Howard Hunt, you could say, in his own bumbling way of being caught in the Watergate and having left evidence in my doctor's office, a chain of evidence, that sort of thing. Also, in particular, Alex Butterfield, up till then a very loyal member of the White House who had been in the room all the time and was one of the very few who knew that Nixon had taped the evidence of all these crimes. Had he not revealed the taping system on his own as one of the very few people who knew of it, Nixon would have stayed in office and the war would have continued through his term, not ending in 75, but not until after 1977 when he left office. So Butterfield's work, which was very much of a whistleblower, an insider who reveals, in his case, a taping system, which he knew would reveal wrongdoing, criminal action by the president, as well as a lot of lying by the president, and a lot of racist talk, by the way. Those tapes revealed as much racism by Richard Nixon privately as Donald Trump has revealed publicly. That's the difference. But in any case, had Butterfield not done that, had John Dean, had a number of people not done what was not expected of them and was very unusual in terms of standing up for the Constitution, included the Attorney General, Richardson, who refused Nixon's order to fire the special prosecutor, in order that Rosenstein or others, people in the Justice Department, may well face in the near future an order by the president to fire Mueller, the special prosecutor. In that case, Elliot Richardson refused to do it, resigned. He was replaced by Ruckelshaus, who also refused. And with two resignations in the same night, that was known as the Saturday Night Massacre, the special prosecutor was fired by the third person in order, Bork, but in the firestorm of protest, the president had to allow the appointment of another special prosecutor. So I'm saying, in no case was it one of these actions by anybody sufficient to bring the president down and make the war endable, bring him down for his crimes and make the war endable. But each one was necessary. I'm one in short of about 50, 100 people whose actions were necessary. Thousands of people contributed in the end, including, by the way, the millions of people who demonstrated against the war and made a strong impression on me and led to the people doing the direct civil disobedience. They all contributed. Individually, though, you can come down with 150 or 100 people who, without them, this thing would not have led to a result. We come then back, obviously, to Julian Assange, who played an absolutely critical role, along with Chelsea, in bringing out information that has not ended the war yet, but may well, we can come back to Chelsea in a moment and Assange, but I think definitely did lead to ending a dictatorship in Tunisia, which has persisted as a relatively democratic regime in North Africa and the Middle East. It also, that in turn, inspired Arab Spring uprisings, which at first looked very promising, in particular in Egypt. They didn't end well. So there's no guarantee that any of this action will affect the world in a good way in the end. It's only necessary.
It's absolutely a butterfly effect that you've just described. And it's one
Assange's actions and Chelsea's actions were more than a butterfly, of course. It was a small earthquake, not even so small. But as I say, we have yet to reap the full benefits of it, but we certainly know an awful lot more of, as Chelsea put it, what the first world, what the US does to the third world, the effect of our imperial operations. And that's why she, through Assange was critical here, wanted to reveal information that went well beyond specific events in Afghanistan and Iraq. People criticized her for this, or protested. She wasn't just revealing wrongdoing by Americans entirely or in Afghanistan. No, she was revealing our manipulation of events in Haiti, for example, and elsewhere in the third world, essentially our imperial operations worldwide. And I think that was a very lasting achievement, which has yet to make a change in our imperial operations, but which I think is that kind of understanding is essential to the change.
It's also akin to the Snowden document. So I've been doing a project for the last year and a half where myself and Elizabeth Lee Voss, who's the editor-in-chief of Disobedient Media, we go through and study every single Snowden document that is available online. And what we have discovered in those documents goes far beyond just the privacy issue or just the surveillance issue. What we've discovered is evidence of the total subversion, the conscious subversion of every facet of human society is being perpetuated by the intelligence agencies, from commercial sphere and technology to academia to trade, obviously, and economics. It is every part of human existence that they are tampering with. It goes far beyond just the surveillance systems. And it's interesting because you just described a moment ago how there was more, they feared more than just the release of the Pentagon Papers. They feared the other information that you have. And there is a wealth of information in the Snowden files which is not yet fully understood. The ramifications are not yet fully understood by the public at large. And in tandem with that, you just described the plumbers and how they had to physically break into an office. And that just showed me that the NSA are the modern day plumbers. The NSA are today's plumbers, but they don't get caught because they don't have to hire stooges necessarily to do a physical break-in when they can electronically rob those psychiatrist files, and the chances of anybody finding out that they have are pretty small.
Yes, they were also yesterday's plumbers, not perhaps quite continuously. They, along with the CIA and the FBI, they were surveilling American communications in the 60s. And
Wow.
That was cut off for a while because of the revelations of the Church Committee and the Pike Committee and others. And in fact, there was apparently a period when they really did have a new ethic in NSA, new for them, which persisted a number of years, from roughly, I think, 75, perhaps to roughly about 2000 or 2001 with 9/11, where they did not proceed without a warrant, at least from a court, to surveil. But starting in 2001, immediately after 9/11, if not a little earlier, under George W. Bush, they began to treat the US as a targeted country, like any enemy or, for that matter, allied country, and to use their access to American communications to sweep it all in a way that the East German government, the German Democratic Republic, so-called, could not do. The Stasi, the secret police of GDR, had in their day no personal computers, no chat logs, no fax, no email to listen to. And now NSA gets all of that, as Snowden's great releases do. Now, Snowden himself, by the way, would be in prison, I think, were it not for Julian Assange, which is not the least of Julian's contributions to the world at all, I would say. Very important. My understanding, just from the press, I don't know any inside knowledge of this, but my understanding is that it was thanks to him that Snowden was able to get out of Hong Kong on his way to Latin America, where he was stopped, even though his passport had been stopped. I think Julian was critical in the Ecuadorean Embassy, of all places, in allowing him to get on a plane and go through Russia, where he was detained for, several weeks with Julian's assistant, Sarah Harrison, to dealing with the Russians before he was granted asylum in Russia. And that the reason he's there is that Barack Obama made it impossible for him by removing his passport to get to Latin America later. And he had to get asylum in Russia, which was not his intention. But I think Julian did anger the Ecuadorian government by his interventions in the embassy with the help of people right there in the embassy. And probably one of his problems right now, and certainly a problem with the government.
Yeah, I think you're correct that it exacerbated the tenuous nature of his situation. Absolutely. Just going back to your book, and particularly your lifelong and almost lifelong anti-nuclear stance, Julian and WikiLeaks released information from the Trident nuclear whistleblower in the United Kingdom. Do you recall that several years ago, relating to the Trident nuclear submarine?
Julian? I don't think I was aware that Julian did that.
WikiLeaks published the testimony of a sailor on the Trident nuclear.
Oh, I remember the testimony, and I don't think I associated with WikiLeaks. I'd like to look that up. Can you tell me just what year that was and exactly?
I will have a look for you right now. It's
I'm very interested in that. That was
on
very
wikileaks.org. His name is William McNeely, the whistleblower, and he was represented by the Courage Foundation, and his testimony was published on wikileaks.org. I will absolutely find the link for you. But the context here is that Julian obviously is also anti-nuclear, and more broadly anti-war, but certainly anti-nuclear. And I was just wanting to make that connection between your work in the anti-nuclear space.
That doesn't surprise me at all, but I didn't know it, and I'm very glad to hear it. Thank you, Julian. I wish you were. I know he can't be watching now, unfortunately, but that is very interesting. I didn't know that connection. You know, my first. Should we go back to my first dealings with Julian at all?
Please. I'm very
actually,
fascinated.
I got an email from someone. Did he use? I don't know if he used the name Julian Assange or whether that came up, but I got an email from someone out of the blue that he was proposing a institution, a website or somehow that would deal in leaked classified material, and make it possible to, put this information out. And that because of my past, he would like me to be not only a sponsor, but I think some, senior consultant to it or something like that. Well, I did write back to this address I was given and never heard from them again. But my first reaction, I remember very well, is, are you kidding? Either this is from NSA itself or the FBI. What could they do better than to encourage people to leak directly to them, and then they'll know what they have? Or it's from somebody very naive who might think he can evade NSA or the FBI. They're probably getting this very email. And so I was either dealing with somebody who is very technically untutored, of course that was the opposite of the truth, or the FBI itself or the NSA itself. So I wrote back very circumspectly, but not very enthusiastically, and nothing came of that in the end. Really, I didn't pay any attention to WikiLeaks, as I think it was called already at that point. No attention, not being technically in on things very much anyway, until the Collateral Murder tape came out. And that made a very strong impression on me, because I recognized very much that the name, which was specifically controversial and led to a lot of criticism later, such a provocative name to call that murder, was exactly apt. I had been a assistant operations officer of a Marine battalion, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines in North Carolina, along with being a company commander. And I'd been in charge of training for the battalion. I'd done training on laws of war. Not very much. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but enough to recognize that what we were seeing on that screen was murder. Not all killing in war is murder, but from the point of view of anyone but an absolute pacifist, which I'm not. Absolute. More and more close to it as time goes by, but not absolute pacifist. So it's not all murder, but a lot of it is. Our firebombing of Tokyo and of earlier cities like Dresden was clear war crime, not a crime against humanity, directed at civilians. And this killing of unarmed, ununiformed civilians, clearly civilians, on suspicion that one was carrying an AK-47, which turned out to be a camera in the hands of a Reuters journalist, and the killing of men who were wounded and crawling along the ground at a time, by the way, when there were people on the ground, American troops approaching that and could have taken prisoner anyone. The deliberate killing of them was murder, nothing but murder. And I was impressed both by the editing and the unedited film, but by coming right out and calling it for what it was. Then the Afghan war logs, and in particular the Iraq war logs, which I participated in releasing at the request of Julian later, I found were exactly the kind of thing that I had hoped would be released for almost 40 years at that point. When I say 40 years, the Pentagon Papers were 1971. These were 2010 and 2011. So it was 39, 40 years later. For the first time, I was seeing somebody putting out material in enough volume to make the point. And of course, when you put it out in that volume, it has another aspect. It makes it very likely that you can be identified as the source of it. And that's why people don't do it. Well, in the case of what Julian was putting out from Chelsea Manning, it included hundreds of examples in Iraq, and for example, of soldiers saying, as Chelsea herself had said, that the prisoners we are involved in handing over to the Iraqi troops are going to be tortured. And we know this torture is going on. And we should not be handing people, especially when she had looked into the case of a particular group that she had worked on and realized that they were nothing other than legal truth-telling whistleblowers, lawyers in some cases, revealing wrongdoing by the Iraqi government. Now, nothing could be more illegal than torture, actually, both in our domestic law and in international law. It's just not possible to get more laws criminalizing that. But they go beyond the torture itself. It's just as illegal and criminal to be handing someone over to be tortured or to be being silent about the torture. So these, as Chelsea herself was told by her intelligence officer when she complained about this, don't worry, just get more suspects. That's our job. Do not investigate further. Well, what Chelsea found when she looked into the documents was that this order had been given to hundreds of people, more than 100 at least, saying, don't investigate further. That's an illegal order, actually, not to investigate because we are internationally obligated to investigate specifically any credible allegation of torture. So here was so many illegal orders going down on a very important crime, war crime here, and illegality, peace crime also, clearly revealing a pattern of behavior. And that pattern in Chelsea's documents went into the current administration, Barack Obama. On the basis of those cables alone, I would say Barack Obama and everybody below him in that chain of command could have been brought before The Hague and accused of criminality. As a matter of fact, which I think has a lot to do with the extreme pursuit of Chelsea Manning that was, right away from the beginning, and the animus toward her, then Bradley, by Barack Obama and others. She also revealed, of course, death squads, also illegal. And again, on such a large scale, because it wasn't just a single document, that it had to come from orders from the top. or high up, at least. It was obviously a pattern here. And finally, I would say Julian's own handling of the Iraq war logs in particular, giving them to journalists, and I would say not revealing them as he had the Afghan war logs all himself, but allowing the journalists to choose what they thought was most newsworthy, which I personally thought was the right way to do it, or preferable way to do it. Well, he did that with the Iraq war logs, and having Julian's choice of giving them to a number of journalist outlets, including not only The Guardian, but Le Monde in French, led to some material being released that would not have been released under a different approach. Specifically, the information that the US knew of corruption and torture and other things by Ben Ali, the dictator of Tunisia, that we knew that we disapproved of it, was picked up by Le Monde, and French, having had the relations with Tunisia all this time, and broadcast in Tunisia on the net. Now, had I personally seen that cable, I would not have been very quick to find it very newsworthy. The US knew of corruption by Ben Ali in Tunisia. As far as I know, it didn't get into the New York Times or The Guardian. Who cared what we were doing here? But by putting all this information out, the kind of thing that Chelsea was criticized for having put out in such a broad way, it did get to Tunisia. At just the time, there was a good deal of resistance to Ben Ali, because his police had fired into crowds of demonstrators who were actually at a funeral for Mohammed Bouazizi, I think his name was, who had burned himself to death because of the corruption of the regime. And this firing into crowds, which, by the way, is going on by the Ortega government right now in Nicaragua, and producing enormous demonstrations there in response. And the student movement was firing in, increased the demonstrations. Into this very situation, then, Le Monde information came in revealing the Chelsea Manning cables. That told the demonstrators not that Ben Ali was corrupt, they knew that already, but the US knew it was corrupt, and it was now public. That knowledge was public, which they felt would restrain the US from openly coming to the support of the dictator, Ben Ali, which they would have done otherwise. It made it too embarrassing for them to do it, to come out when it was known publicly, thanks to Assange and Chelsea, that and Le Monde, that they knew this was a corrupt, unpopular dictator who was in power only because of his oppression. So they went ahead in the belief that the US would not overthrow their revolution necessarily, and that they had a chance of succeeding, which they did. And Ben Ali, weeks later, fled the country. So there was a case. I think there should be a statue, since it remains relatively democratic now and open for the first time in many decades in that society. There should be a statue of Chelsea Manning and of Julian Assange in Tunisia. Long story there, but
those are
makes the point that truth-telling like this can have effects that you don't foresee, and that Julian, I really do applaud his judgment at that time of making that much material, and Chelsea also, available ultimately to Le Monde and to Tunisia.
Absolutely. And these are the types of events that are so momentous that the effects carry on through generations. It's not the news story that flies by in a day or a week or a news cycle. It really is intergenerational in its impact. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Dan, what would be your message right now to Julian, knowing the situation that he is in?
Well, first, let me just talk about the situation. My message to Julian would be, Julian, as you know, I support you. I love you. And I do. I liked him very much when I was with him in London for a few days, putting out the Iraq war logs at a press conference. And then later, I liked him very much. And I don't, by the way, just to put this in context, that support is heard from a person, me, who does not agree with Julian's judgment in every respect, or even either at the time or later. That's true for practically anybody. I personally, where I find I disagree with him over the last year or two, really, in a number of judgments, I personally give him a lot of slack as a friend in my mind, as someone who's been wrongly in one room, essentially, for 6 years. I don't hold him too accountable for that. I'm prepared in a different context, we don't have time for it here, to be critical of some of his judgments. But none of that bears on the wrongness of his first, and go backwards in time here, his being held incommunicado by the Ecuadorian government, which I think is totally unjustified and wrongful. And I think their excuse for doing it doesn't hold up. I don't know, we don't have a lot of time here to go into all that. But second, I think it's absolutely the case. I think that his lawyers and he are absolutely right in believing that it is almost certain that if he were out of that right now in the hands of the British authorities for having skipped his conditions of confinement 6 years ago or so, that he would be extradited to the United States, that he would be held wrongfully incommunicado, essentially, as Snowden would be, possibly for the rest of his life, and that would be an unprecedented trial, absolutely wrong, under the First Amendment of the United States, which forbids the use of the Espionage Act, US 18 US 70, you know this very well, 18 US 79.3, sign number 23, paragraphs D and E. That's the first time I've ever tripped on that. I have that one very well in mind, statute, because I was the first person prosecuted under it for having given information to the press and to the public. And in my case, of course, it was as a former government official who was being tried under this. No one had been tried for a leak before. In Julian's case, it would be even more unprecedented and clearly unconstitutional, because it would be the use against a journalist, against essentially a publisher. When I said that I identified in particular with Chelsea and Ed Snowden, somewhat more than with my friend Julian, it's because they were sources like me of information. They were whistleblowers. Julian is someone who essentially is an essential part of facilitating whistleblowing, as does the New York Times sometimes, and The Guardian and Le Monde, as I've just told, a publisher without whom this information wouldn't get out as reliably, although we now do have the internet as an alternative. So his role, I think, was essential, as is that of other journalists. This would be the first trial under the so-called Espionage 793 D&E of a journalist for putting out, which I think almost any lawyer would say would clearly be unconstitutional, but that doesn't mean it would be held to be unconstitutional by the recent Supreme Court, still less by the current Supreme Court, or one that Trump may put in power. The likelihood is that, damn the Constitution, I think with them, get this guy. And he wouldn't be charged with treason, though the word is used from first, he's not an American citizen, but even Chelsea or Ed would not be charged for that, because our Constitution confines that to people who adhere to the enemies of the United States and aid them and abet them in waging war against the United States. So I wasn't charged with that, but in my 12 counts. But by using a law that was intended to be used only against spies, especially during wartime, against somebody who aids the journalistic process of the free press and of informing the public, would mean, if that were successful, and it could be under the current court system, a real change in our constitution and in our regime. It would be a regime change. It would be a change to something much less than a democracy, in that it would silence people who put out information on wrongdoing or information that simply the public needs to know and should know from inside the government. Confining the press to being nothing more than public relations people, essentially, for the government, putting out government handouts. That's all we would know. And that's not a democracy. We've come very far from democratic institutions in recent years, as Ed Snowden revealed. But the pursuit of Assange would be one step further and would essentially chill, put it that way, all leaking and whistleblowing. There would be people who would go ahead anyway, like Ed or Chelsea or me. As Chelsea put it, she was prepared to face life in prison. She said to her informant, who turned her in, she said, or even capital punishment. Ed said, there are things worth dying for. And I think that included what he put out. But when I read those statements, I thought, they're like me. That's the way I felt. And there are others. We're not alone in that. Unfortunately, it's not as many as there should be. We will not, I think, move away from the risk of nuclear war that we are now facing and have been for most of my life. We won't change the system of doomsday machines. We won't address the climate problem adequately, or many, many other problems, without a great deal more moral courage than we have seen from anybody, from most officials now. And that will take moral courage like that of Ed and Chelsea and Julian Assange, a willingness to risk prison, risk even being killed, which I think was very much a danger for Ed Snowden, and could be for Julian, and suffer, as Ed has done, what I think will be permanent exile. Chelsea, 7.5 years in prison. Ed confined to a room here, essentially by the legal challenges posed to him, and constitutionally, extra constitutionally. I think the press has been delinquent all this time in not challenging the secrecy system as in its unconstitutional aspects more than it has. They simply don't understand. To give them the benefit of the doubt here, even the ones who are most willing to confront the government don't understand how much they are lied to, how many wrongful secrets are kept, and how this is done with the threat of the kind of prosecution that Julian is facing. So finally, I know we've reached the end of our time here. I would like Julian to be out of that, what is like a cell. It's not quite as bad as, let's say, what Chelsea Manning or Mordecai Vanunu, the solitary confinement that Chelsea had for 10.5 months, and Vanunu in Israel had for something like 10.5 years in confinement. It's not as bad as that. It's permanent exile, though, and Assange has been in one room, away from the sun, longer than is good for anyone. When I question his judgment on some things, I would question my judgment if I'd been spent 6 years in a room away from the sun. I wouldn't want to trust it too much. I want him to get out of that room without being extradited. And the immediate effect is to let him get the medical attention that he needs, very clearly needs, under a guarantee of the British and the Americans that he will not be imprisoned or extradited for that purpose, for that humane purpose. And I agree with his lawyer, Jen Robinson, and others, giving good legal advice. Pressure on the British government to allow him to get out of that room, at least to get the medical attention. But beyond that, to assure him of extradition, of exile, not extradition, to Ecuador.
Safe passage to Ecuador.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Wow. I think you're absolutely spot on every point, Dan. I think your estimation regarding the Espionage Act is spot on. We saw Pompeo lay the groundwork, the foundation, by calling WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service. You're absolutely right that Julian's medical situation, the denial of medical care, is taking things to a completely different level. He is absolutely at mortal risk, as his doctors have been warning since 2016.
The press in other countries don't all have the protections that they are supposed to have in this country because they don't have a First Amendment elsewhere. But the American press should be taking up much more actively his cause on this thing, as of other whistleblowers, because really, with Julian prosecuted on this, every one of them is who does his or her job of revealing information the public needs to know would be in danger of a kind of assault that journalists have not had to face in the 200 years of our history.
So just as we saw Obama prosecute, was it 10 whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, we may, in that eventuality, see 10 journalists within an administration prosecuted under the Espionage Act. It could create a precedent.
Yes, absolutely. I think, by the way, Donald Trump in particular, remember that Obama prosecuted more people than all previous presidents put together. In fact, 3 times as many. And the previous number was small. It was 3. The reason it was so small was that their prosecution was effectively unconstitutional, and people knew it, and they were avoiding it. Obama prosecuted 9 or 10, if you include Petraeus. And there's over here, lawyers for the American Civil Liberties Union feel confident, unfortunately, that Donald Trump will attempt to prosecute journalists. Probably Assange would be his number 1 favorite for that, because Assange could not count on other journalists protesting as much as they should. And that's basically shameful of them, I would say. But at any rate, that would make him their prime desire for going after journalists.
Well, just as you were inspired by the mass movements against the Vietnam War, yes, we are creating here the seedling of a mass movement in support of Julian Assange. So I do hope that in the coming years, some of those journalists may check their 6 and get on board.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you for being on board.
Thank you so much for being here. It means the world to us to have you here, and I know it means a huge deal to Julian as well. So thank you very much, Dan Ellsberg. Round of applause from all the people watching.